All right, and then I will start live streaming.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in, and we're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute or two to give folks time to trickle in. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in, and we're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute or two to give folks time to trickle in.
Addie, I'm hearing an echo. Are you there?
Yeah, I think you may need to pause or close the Event Mobi app on your end so we aren't hearing it in both places.
Addie, I'm hearing an echo. Are you? Perfect.
Are we good to go ahead and get started? All right, cool, thanks. Welcome everybody. My name is Addie Schlessel. I'm the Stream Monitoring and AIS Coordinator with the Rock River Coalition. And I wanna thank you guys for being here and welcome you to back to the Rock River Basin Day here. I also want to thank and welcome our speaker, Mark Riedel from the Wisconsin DNR. Mark's going to be speaking about the Rock River Basin's TMDL, which is the total maximum daily load. So looking forward to hearing more about that. This session will go until 12:30, and we're hoping to have a few minutes for questions at the end. So feel free to type any questions that arise in your mind in the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the session. Just as an FYI, we won't be able to see the chat, so if you want to send us questions, make sure to put those under Q&A. And you're also able to upvote any questions that you're especially interested in hearing us answer, so you can feel free to use that option as well. And with that, I'm gonna go ahead and hand things over to Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, my pleasure. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Super. Welcome everybody. I live rural, so if I get kicked off the internet, I'm going to jump onto my Wi-Fi hotspot and I will be back shortly. So just a heads up. I am a Tmdl project manager with the South Central region of the DNR. Technically, my position is split 50-50. I also have a similar role covering the Southeast region and the Milwaukee TMDLs. Been working in the field going on 25 plus years. With the DNR since 2014. Before that, I worked extensively with Army Corps of Engineers, Canadian government, EPA, and other agencies doing AOC and habitat restoration, dam removal, fish passage related work on the Western Great Lakes. I was previously a research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service, doing experimental watershed research, restoration work. So I've been really fortunate to work on a lot of neat projects in different parts of the Midwest and the Great Lakes and the Appalachians, and even done some restoration work in the Caribbean. So try and tap into that as I go through that. Kind of the first half of my presentation is going to kind of focus on some background information. So I'm planning on going through that pretty quickly, kind of history of the TMDL, et cetera. Just thinking that most people are probably familiar with that, and try and focus more on the more recent stuff. Let's see here if I can advance my slide. There we go. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm very happy to be here. And the previous presentations and the ones following are great examples of project-specific things that are happening in the basin. And so I'm not going to really delve into the details of those. I will touch on them, but you know, implementation of the TMDL's restoration happens at the local level. It's led locally, and so it's great to hear those stories as well. Today, I'll talk about the historical perspective, just give a brief overview of the TMDL, talk about TMDL implementation, and then recovery and expectations. The historical perspective, you know, these large watersheds have a long memory, and we lose sight of that. And so, you know, going back to 1855, Increase Lapham was a surveyor sent here to survey to build a canal between the Rock River over to the Great Lakes, and was the first engineer / surveyor that was known to document the region and send back reports of how fertile and how amazing the Rock River Basin was, and sent those out east. And that really kind of helped spark a land rush of people that were thinking about coming to this area. When they heard about how fertile the soils were and how prolific and beautiful and amazing the waters were, it really set up kind of a tidal wave of people coming to the area. And so when European settlers came here, we started building things. You know, we built the roads so they drained right into the river. You know, horse-drawn buggies, horses, carriages, all the manure, all the waste, all the dirt, all the soil and sediment to make those roads passable. That's how we did things back then. Our roads are still laid out this way today. Those buildings were built. We didn't tear the buildings down. And so when we look at any of our villages, any of our cities, you know, drainage largely follows gravity. And so our modern storm sewer systems, you know, kind of mimic that past. You know, it wasn't long after our settlers came here that we brought domesticated livestock, and we had to get them watering sources. Before the dams were put in on the Rock River, it was common to have cattle drives across the Rock River at shallow points. Most of the places where you see dams today are areas where there were cattle crossings, areas where there were shallow points, natural areas to take advantage of to put dams in the river. We also brought carp. In the late 1890s, we introduced carp as a low-cost, high-protein food source. We were, you know, I'm German. My family came here, and we had family farms who spoke German, and so the German carp were brought, and they proliferated, and they've done really well. Now, this postcard I'm showing is a little bit of a joke. That's not the true size of a carp that was caught in Horicon Marsh. But going back as far as then, we realized that, you know, maybe we made a mistake, and carp are prolific through the system. We channelized all over, and we cut off river meanders. We connected lakes. We turned complex flowages like the Madison Lakes into channelized systems, channelized the connecting rivers for navigation, for a variety of reasons. This is how we built storm sewers back in the day. We trenched clay pipes, sometimes wood pipes down the center of streams. All the manure and runoff, they followed gravity, they went into the nearest lake. And again, you know, those buildings were put in place. We didn't change the layout of the roads, we just paved over it, kept the storm sewers where they were, maybe updated them. But again, gravity-driven systems. We dumped our waste in the lakes. We dumped our waste in the rivers. It was a convenient thing to do. Fill them in. The swamps were seen as wastelands. Fill them in. Put pollutants in the river to wash it away into the nearest lake. You know, before the Clean Water Act, all of our outfalls, untreated waste, untreated sewage, went right into our lakes and rivers. These are all photos from the Rock River Basin, by the way. We regularly dumped raw human waste into the lakes and into the rivers. This is the Ohio River in 1959. And there was widespread accounts of fish kills, people having breathing problems because of the fumes coming off of the Rock River, coming off of the lakes, people getting rashes from swimming in the water. During storms, you'd see these large pillows of foam from the phosphorus in the water below the dams, below any of the rivers. We had widespread fish kills. There's photos going back quite a bit further, but this one's from 1970. This is a DNR warden documenting a fish kill in the Ohio River. And, you know, we've all heard about the Cuyahoga River and its fires. While we haven't had a fire on the Rock River, this is actually in Milwaukee, downtown Milwaukee. A large fire burned for 3 days on the Milwaukee River. The Rock River, we have firsthand accounts that we have heard from people, farmers who lived on the river in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The river was so toxic you couldn't go in it. People would break out, they'd get hives. There'd be dead cattle in the river. There'd be barrels from old chemical fertilizers, from agricultural chemicals. Industry, all of the industries were located along the river because that's where the mills were. And so people just dumped stuff in the river. Ultimately, that led to the Clean Water Act. And I'm not going to go into the full history of it. People spend an entire semester talking about the Clean Water Act. Suffice it to say, starting in 1972, and it really focused on point source pollution. It's evolved over time, starting in the 90s with lawsuits addressing non-point pollution. But again, the direct authority to implement the Clean Water Act is focused on point sources via regulatory permits. So I know I went through that quick, but that's what we've inherited. Those are kind of the sins of our fathers, and we need to remember that these watersheds that we live in, they don't forget these things. And so Kyle gave a great example of the memory of these systems that we're dealing with. They remember what happened 100 years ago, even if we don't. So with the TMDL, the Clean Water Act, the first thing that we do as a state, we are the delegated authority under the state-federal partnership. We develop water quality standards. They're narrative standards that talk about objectionable deposits and algae and turbidity, and they really get at our uses of our waters being fishable, drinkable, and swimmable. We also have a numeric criteria for phosphorus, but that is one of our obligations. Next obligation is we inventory our waters. We designate our waters about what sort of uses they are intended to have. Every 2 years, we review those waters of the state. And this is an ongoing process because there are so many rivers and so many lakes. We can't do them all in a few years or even a decade. In many areas, we don't have enough data. And so we go through a process by updating the biennial impaired waters list. Most recently, it was updated in 2020. And we don't just update waters that are impaired. In Wisconsin, we also document waters that are extraordinary, waters of high quality, high value. And it doesn't just mean the pristine waters up north. It could also mean a river or a lake that is an area of high population. And so it gets a lot of use. It provides a great deal of benefit to the users. And so we protect those waters as well. Within the Rock River Basin, again, 3,800 square miles. We've got 10 counties, 85 wastewater treatment facilities, 48 MS4 communities. So those are municipalities that have populations of over 10,000 people at the last census, and they're a regulated stormwater entity with a discharge permit. At the time of the TMDL being published, we had 62 impaired waters, 20 for TSS, 3 for phosphorus, and then 39 for both. Once we've done that, we completed that process, we have to go through and develop plans to restore the designated uses of our waters. And these plans are called Tmdl plans, or total maximum daily load plans. And what we have to do in these plans is identify the pollutants that are causing the impairments, and what are the sources of those pollutants, and what are the strategies and tools that we have to rein those in so that they are meeting a level where we can restore the designated uses. So we develop a TMDL. The TMDL is not supposed to be friendly, and most people are pretty familiar with the Rock River TMDL now. When it first came out, people pushed back really hard. People were afraid of what a TMDL meant. They thought it was pointing a finger. The TMDL is meant to be like an honest visit with your personal physician. It's supposed to, here's what we have, here's what we know, these are the issues. So it's not intended to point fingers or anything like that. It's just meant to lay out, here's what we have, and here's our estimates of where we need to get on a restoration pathway. So what is a TMDL actually? If you want to think about it, it's almost like a prescription or an exercise plan that you would develop with a physician to get yourself back in health. It's a TMDL numerically is the amount of pollutant a water body can handle and meet the water quality standards. And it's the assimilative capacity, which is really important. There's a concept that our waters, depending on the nature of the water and geology and soils and various other things, they can assimilate a certain amount of constituents, whether it's total suspended solids, nutrients, sediment, etc., and provide beneficial uses that we all need and want and desire. And that's the assimilative capacity. The TMDL says that we've exceeded that, therefore we're seeing issues. Within the TMDL, when we compute what the pollutants are, we have to develop a load allocation. So we partition part of that to non-point sources, such as agriculture. We develop a point source allocation, which goes to the waste load allocation, which goes to our point sources, and then what's called the margin of safety. The allocations from the Rock River TMDL, we frequently will see a pie graph. We usually only see the upper one when people do presentations and people point the fingers at agriculture and we say, 64% of the total phosphorus comes from agriculture. The TMDL analysis was over a 10-year period, and there was 1 year in particular where that's a calibrated model using observed data. There was 1 year in particular, extremely wet, that produced a very large runoff event and a very large load. And that pretty much dominated some of the TMDL analysis. And in many of the other years, if you're getting less than half an inch of rain, quarter inch of rain, you're not getting runoff from agricultural areas, but you're going to be getting it from impervious areas. You're going to be getting discharges from point sources. And so importantly, the TMDL doesn't just look at the average annual. What we sometimes forget is the lower graph is the average monthly, and this is total phosphorus. Again, thinking to that notion of assimilative capacity. When you have a lot of water in the system, you can take a higher loading. When we look at what was limiting total phosphorus on a monthly basis, it turned it out to be discharges from point sources. And if you think about July, August, September, maybe getting into October, our receiving waters tend to be heat stressed. They tend to be in low flow conditions. Our aquatic biota tend to be heat stressed. That's when our systems have the least resiliency and the lowest assimilative capacity. That also tends to be when proportionately we're putting the largest load from point sources into the system. We're using a lot of electricity, we're using a lot of power, and that discharge relative to the receiving water volume is high. And so the assimilative capacity tends to be lower when the point sources are dominating. And so the TMDL accommodates that. It addresses loading from agricultural systems, but it also importantly addresses loading from point sources and during periods of time when our systems are really stressed. Outreach began in 2009 through 2011, talking about TMDL development. Just kind of briefly, 2013 to 2015, we had a series of workshops throughout the basin dealing with point sources, helping them understand how the TMDLs would affect their permits and what implementation would look like for them. 2014 to 17, we had a series of quarterly meetings throughout the basin. We had annual meetings and a number of working meetings with counties and local partners, talking about strategies and how to implement the TMDL. 2016 to 19, our stormwater folks were focused on rewriting stormwater permits to start accommodating needs of the TMDL. And really 2017 through the present, we've shifted away from the broad audience types of meetings where we're introducing the TMDL, we're providing an overview of the TMDL, and now we're doing working meetings. And so we're meeting one-on-one with counties, we're meeting one-on-one with farmer-led groups, we're helping groups write grants, we're helping them develop project ideas, helping them find sources of funding. And so myself, our staff, are really focused on being out in the communities and working in those areas. If people are looking for more information, we have our website. The information on our website tends to be static. It's a lot harder to update the website just because of state rules from the Department of Administration, et cetera. And our website is meant to be kind of a repository of what we call permanent information. For more up-to-date information, we have the Rock River Recovery, which is our newsletter. We've been publishing it monthly since 2014, 86 issues so far. In there, we focus on DNR updates, calendars of events that are relevant to water quality, restoration, things that are going on across the basin, grant updates, partner updates. We share information on neat projects. Obviously, folks can go in there and manage their Gov Delivery subscription. This is where we really direct people. If you want to know what's going on, if you want to share a story, if you want to learn about something, the newsletter is the place that we do that. And we don't push the newsletter. We are a state organization. We're not going to shove this out onto people's email as spam. So people have to come in and subscribe to it through Gov Delivery, or they can send requests to myself. They can subscribe directly on the newsletter. And when people subscribe, sometimes they hear that, oh, I'm not getting the newsletter, I subscribed. It's important to look at the spam settings on your email. About 80% of the rejections that we get are because of spam settings. The newsletters tend to include a lot of hyperlinks to PDFs, other websites, that sort of thing, and sometimes that can trigger spam settings. So conceptually, what does TMDL implementation look like? And this is just kind of a broad view, a broad picture. But when we start off and we're developing a TMDL, we're kind of at time zero, and we've acknowledged that there's an issue, we've acknowledged that there's a problem, and there's pollution. And the TMDL partitions out that pollution to a background load, a reserve capacity, and then again those point sources and non-point sources and stormwater. And we have to develop a strategy to get them over time down so that we're reaching the allowable load. Now, kind of logically, as I mentioned earlier, we have direct authority through the Clean Water Act to write permit limits into wastewater permits. And so we anticipate that we can make the most rapid progress, if you will, and I'm saying anticipate, I'm using air quotes, on the wastewater side of things, because we do have that direct line authority. But you can see there's a little devil there peeking through, and the devil's in the details moving forward. As we've written those wastewater permits, we anticipate that we start to see a transition. So, wastewater facilities are upgrading, and the legwork that it takes to build the community of implementation in non-point, because it's really a grassroots effort that's starting to come together. There's not that funding there, for example. Finding grants, finding resources. A wastewater treatment facility charges their ratepayers. We don't have that in the transition to looking at non-point. So there's a transition period. As we continue on, the wastewater facilities are continually optimizing, doing upgrades, doing what they need to do. They're making a lot of progress. Seeing out into the future, some of that fog is disappearing. We're understanding how some of those details are coming together, and non-point, both from rural non-point and stormwater, they're getting their reductions as well. But again, it takes time to build up that capacity, because some of the things that are asked in TMDL, they're really big asks. If you take a community that's 100 years old or 150 years old and their stormwater infrastructure is already there, you can't ask a community to rip all the stormwater infrastructure up. And then ultimately over time, this is just really kind of how we view this process, that it's this transition. We're really focusing on point sources and then transitioning more into non-point. What do we see with TMDL implementation in reality? I know I've gone kind of quickly in this first half, and so if there's questions, I'll happy to ask them at the end. I'm gonna do a quick time check because I just want to see how I'm doing for time. Okay, so now I'll talk about actual TMDL implementation. So those figures I just showed you are kind of the concept level, right? So this is what it actually is looking like in the Rock River Basin. So we have the point source pollution, wastewater industry, stormwater from the large MS4s, the large cities, and CAFOs. Those are covered by a WPDES, Wisconsin Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. So we've got the direct federal authority to write those permits. So with our wastewater in Wisconsin, if we look at our permits, we're now down to 81 total in the Rock River Basin. And this graph in the lower right, you can see that 63% of our permitted facilities in the Rock River Basin are now in their second permit term of having TMDL limits. So each permit term is 5 years. So 50 of our facilities in the Rock River Basin are now in their second term of having a TMDL permit. The remaining ones you can see are in the third, fourth, and fifth years of their permits. Those will be wrapping up. Some of those fifth-year ones will be wrapping up this year. And so we're continually making progress, ticking these off step by step, as spelled out in the permit statute, permit authority. And a small number of these have been discontinued. So what does implementation look like for a wastewater treatment plant? When we take a look at this graph, you've got, the first number tells you the number of permits, the second number tells you the percentage. And I'm going to focus on the top pie chart there that you see, the blue, the red one, and the purple one. Nearly half of our facilities are taking advantage of what we call a watershed approach, whether it's watershed-based permit compliance or the multi-discharge variance. This is where a facility is partnering with the county, partnering with farmers, partnering with others to help offset the cost of upgrading their treatment plant. And so they're looking to others to help find the reductions. So a treatment plant, let's say they're told they have to get a 30% reduction. It may cost them a lot of money. And so they may find a way that rather than having that reduction themselves and lowering the amount of pollution they're discharging, they will go and partner with somebody who will offset that. Okay, so nearly half of our communities, half of our facilities in the Rock River Basin are taking advantage of some of these watershed-based alternatives. We've got 13 that have no limits, and so these may be surface discharger, irrigation or something like that. So they have a permit, but they're just not using it. Maybe they've shut down an outfall, they don't need it anymore. 11% or 18%, 11 of the facilities are meeting the limits. So probably through optimization of their existing facility, they've been able to meet the limits. And we've got 10 or 17% who are undecided. So these are those facilities who need to figure out what they're going to do, have a couple of years to do that with their facilities plan, and we'll be working with our engineers and our permit drafters and their consultants to figure out what makes the most sense for them. Our stormwater program, we have 245 MS4s that are covered by individual permit and general permit statewide, 176 that are covered by the general permit. And so again, this is your stormwater discharge from your cities. And so, what's going into your curbs and gutters and then coming out of a storm pipe. So it's really non-point pollution, non-point runoff, urban runoff, stormwater, oil, grease, nutrients, leaves, everything that's in it, collected into a pipe system and then discharged into the stream. The strategy of implementation via the MS4 permits is, there's the current permit term that the communities had when the TMDL was drafted. And then our staff developing a strategy to implement the TMDL in the next permit term, developing an implementation planning requirement. And so when those facilities roll into the next permit, they have an implementation planning requirement, what they're going to do to make progress towards meeting the TMDL. And then the subsequent permit providing compliance schedule and performance benchmarks, where they're talking about the number of practices that they've put in place. And, it could be, we're going to do a leaf study. We're going to build X number of rain gardens. We're going to retrofit a dry pond and turn it into a wet pond or something like that. And so these different benchmarks or milestones, if you will, that show progress towards implementing practices that will help meet the TMDL goals. Within the Rock River, we had 48 MS4s in 2011. 2 were added because of the updated census data. I shouldn't say they were added in 2011. They were updated just most recently. We updated the individual permits for 21 municipalities that are included in Dane County in 2019. That includes TMDL requirements. And then the remainder are covered under the general permit, and that took place in May 1st of 2019. Within the general permit, the requirements are contained in Appendix A, the Rock River TMDL. Here's an example of type of things that municipalities can do. This is a Madison Leaf study. It's spread to a number of communities. It's really neat stuff. Local partners, working with partner agencies, finding local solutions. It can be really hard to try and implement some of these practices when you're a municipality. You have levy limits and all sorts of things facing you. We talk about the curbs and gutters straight piping into the lakes and rivers, and some of the preliminary data in this case, 150% reduction in total phosphorus following the trial street sweeping compared to the control. So over a very short time period of a few weeks, identifying that, hey, there are some areas that could potentially contribute a lot of phosphorus directly to our lakes and rivers. And so, is this something we can develop a strategy around to try and implement a strategic leaf sweeping policy? I mentioned, watershed-based permit compliance. This is what it looks like currently in the state of Wisconsin. And if you look at the south central part of the state, the Rock River Basin, you see we have a large cluster of communities, and this is both wastewater treatment plants as well as municipalities that are taking advantage of these watershed-based permit options. And it's really an exciting thing. It's a wonderful thing. The reason for this is the relative cost of implementation. Upgrading a treatment plant, it can easily cost thousands to tens of thousands of dollars per pound of phosphorus removed. Where if we partner with farmers or partner with others In non-point, we're looking at tens of dollars to maybe, a few $100s to remove a pound of phosphorus. So far more cost effective. And this is why the watershed-based options are really nice and help move the ball forward and help build relationships across the watershed community so we can all work towards our shared goals together. Speaking of non-point, our non-point program, the previous entities or the previous implementation I talked about is driven through that federal authority via the permits. Our non-point program addresses agricultural runoff from small farms, medium farms, and stormwater runoff from small communities and construction sites. We have NR 151 performance standards for agriculture. In the Rock River Basin, the NR 151 performance standards, I'm not going to go through them all here. This is a summary of them, but these represent the baseline condition. So if there's say a 40% reduction in a certain subwatershed, that's a 40% reduction from this baseline condition. So that would be assuming that all of the NR 151 performance standards are being met. And that can be a big ask. And so, the reason I'm bringing this up is, in the past, watershed practitioners and myself included, I'm not, pointing fingers, but when we look at the audits of how we did our non-point work in the past, we really spent a lot of time treating symptoms and what some people call conservation whack-a-mole. And sorry, my phone's going off here. I'm just trying to make sure I'm still connected. Am I still connected there?
Yep, we can still hear and see you.
Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure I didn't get kicked off. Audits that were done by the Office of Management and Budget, dating back to the 1990s and again in the 2000s, looked at how long federally funded conservation practices lasted. And this is just a snippet. This doesn't tell the entire story, but it's an example. And this was an example of buffer programs that were paid for in Iowa and Illinois. And what it shows is that the buffer practices didn't last long. The orange represents the buffers that were gained. The red represents the buffers that were lost. And this idea of putting band-aids, on patches and on hotspots, we spent a lot of decades doing that. And there's a lot of things that we didn't understand about the challenges in the agricultural economy. And so that's why people kind of, like I said, they call it, kind of conservation whack-a-mole. There's really important stuff that's happened out there. Really important stuff. So I don't want to undermine that. Grassed waterways, sediment basins, all kinds of, barnyard treatment systems. There's very, very important stuff that has been incredibly beneficial and incredibly valuable. But sometimes we feel like we're spinning our wheel. And we end up in this perpetual loop of funding a point source or a BMP at a certain area and then go away. And a few years later, it's still there. Maybe it was rented land. Maybe the land changed hands, or for some other reason. So we don't even know if these practices are still there. We lose track of them. And we failed to pay attention to the agricultural economy. For every dollar we have for programs to do non-point practices, federal, state, and local combined, the Farm Bill alone provides $8 to basically maintain the status quo. And I'm not, I don't mean to go into politics or anything like that of it. That's just the reality of it. And so, when we look at counties are bringing in tens and even hundreds of millions of dollars in agricultural revenue every year in the state of Wisconsin. There's just a huge difference in economies there. And so the things that we can fund are important as demonstration projects, et cetera, but our agricultural land is managed privately and it's private land holdings. And so, we can't solve our problems with the same thing that we used when we created them. And so implementation on the non-point front, our strategy, and I know that of others, is really about looking to farmers and using local solutions, local control, and farmer-led groups and building relationships. And so that's what we've really strived to do is working with the local county staff, agronomists, working with DATCAP and others to identify that, hey, we have something in common. We all care about soil health. Me as a DNR employee, I care about soil health because it gives me water quality. I mean, I also care about the land, and it's very important to me as a steward. So I care about it from that perspective. But protecting soil health also protects water quality, and that gets us to our goals. Farmers care about soil health because it's profitability. It's about long-term longevity. It's about stability of their farm. It's about productivity of their system. And when farmers work to protect soil health and they're doing it locally, they retain local control so that somebody's not coming in with that big Band-Aid and telling them to fix something that may or may not be a workable solution for that farmer. And so when we look at that approach and what it's led to in the Rock River Basin, and I'm not meaning to imply that we, the DNR, not at all. I mean, this is not something we came up with. There's a long history of farmer-led groups and groups that have been started by others. We certainly are supportive of it, and this is really a strategy we see going forward is the way that we're going to do it. When we look at the mosaic, at the large patchwork quilt of the Rock River Basin, we say, what are going to be the photographs of implementation and restoration? How do we handle all that at once? We can't, right? How do you eat that elephant one bite at a time? And that's what really is, that's non-point implementation. Our county partners doing really, really vital work. Our local farmers and farmer-led groups, recruiting more farmers, making long-term changes on the land that are going to benefit all of us. And so when we look at this, a watershed implementation picture across the Rock River Basin, this figure, the first thing I want to point out is where you see a subwatershed that's yellow and there's a 0 on the legend, that doesn't mean there's nothing going on, okay? These are things where there's formal DNR involvement and it's either through a grant or a formal program or something like that. There's things going on all over the Rock River Basin. But the ones that we're tracking actively, we're actively involved in, you see, anywhere from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even more projects on the different HUC 12 watersheds within the Rock River Basin. There's 120 of them, by the way. So these are active farmer-led groups. They've got a 9 key element plan that's being implemented. They've got Tmdl permits that are being implemented. There's a formal watershed implementation initiative that's being implemented. There's a county initiative that's being implemented. And so there is quite a wealth of implementation going on throughout the basin. Looking at recovery and expectations. So, we talk about phosphorus in the Rock River Basin, and it's one number in the stream. And the Clean Water Act is not about meeting a phosphorus target, and neither is delisting the water. Our waters are listed because they're impaired, and we look at the aquatic ecosystems. We look at the different criteria of being fishable, swimmable, drinkable waters, habitat, health of the bugs, health of the fishes. I showed this though just to show the long-term trend of phosphorus reductions in the Rock River. It's definitely trending in the right direction. We have made a wealth of progress and it's continuing to trend in the right direction. And there's data on subwatersheds throughout that showed this as well. The corollary is we also know that we have watersheds that need more help within the Rock River Basin. So certainly, groups like the Rock River Coalition, our county partners and others who are doing that implementation at the ground level, those individual pieces, patches on that patchwork quilt are vitally important. But it's important for us to step back and take a look because sometimes we forget we've made a lot of progress. We need to think about ecosystem resilience. This figure demonstrates ecosystem resilience. You can have an ecosystem on that. I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer, the little humpy figure that's the furthest back with the ball. That's a stable location. That's a stable state to the ecosystem. If that ecosystem gets pushed over that hump, it can jump into a different form of stability with a different type of system. So think of our shallow lakes. They can be clear water systems and shallow with lots of vegetation, or they can be pea soup with little vegetation and a lot of carp. They're both stable states, right? So those low spots in this figure are stable states. Those earlier black and white slides I showed, the resilience in an ecosystem is this hump. How much can we push that ecosystem before it breaks and goes over a threshold, right? That's the resilience of the ecosystem. We've used up a lot of the resilience. A lot of the things that have happened well before we were here, that were what I call the sins of our fathers, we've inherited these. And so we can't expect silver bullet solutions. We can't expect to make things better with a simple act. The cumulative effects add up, and it's not the one straw that broke the camel's back. It's all the ones that were added on it completely. And so A lot of our restoration efforts are going to take multiple acts, coordinated acts. And as we learn, much like Kyle and Dane County and working with the USGS and other partners, learn the importance of, hey, we're seeing things on the land, we're seeing things in the water quality criteria. We're getting signals in the data that we didn't expect. What's going on here? Oh, legacy sediment. Some of the stuff's over 125 years old. It's delivering a lot of phosphorus into the stream and into the lakes. And so it's that learning process, that adaptive management process, understanding that as we do these things, we may learn that we need to do some additional work to help relieve that burden that was put on potentially decades ago. When we look at the time scale of ecosystem restoration, the small systems, we can expect, first order streams, something like that. You can do restoration effort in a fairly short time frame, perhaps a decade or a couple of decades. As we get these bigger systems, it takes more time because it's a larger geographic scale. The bigger the system gets, the more memory that it has, the more legacy sediment that's stored, the more carp that are in the system, the more dams that are there, etc. And so our future challenges going forward, I think supporting farmer-led groups is vitally important. Our farmers are on the front lines, and they are implementing stuff really quickly. It's frankly hard to keep up with all the amazing things that the farmers are doing. I feel incredibly fortunate and grateful. I work with 9 farmer-led groups across the southern part of the state. I can't keep up with what they're doing. And so supporting, the county LCD departments, county staff, agronomists, the folks that are out there on the front lines in the trenches, they're the ones that are getting things done. Our municipal staff doing the stormwater work. We need to support our folks in the trenches who are doing this. We heard mention of the importance of climate change and resiliency, relating that with stormwater and development. We know our agricultural lands and the good practices that are going out there can absorb a lot of the challenges of climate change. Once we start paving things, it gets a lot harder. Rental land is a big challenge. 30 to 70% of our farmers' land base in the Rock River Basin is rented. And what's the impetus for a farmer to put a lot of practices in on a piece of land that they may lose the contract on, and all that benefit then goes to somebody the farmer's competing with. So that's a big challenge, I think. Carp definitely are going to continue to be a challenge. The legacy phosphorus and TSS, we've talked about, and then habitat. We know we can restore the water quality, but what we learned from Pleasant Branch and other restoration projects, we often also have to invest in habitat. And that, again, that's something that's come out of the Dane County Suck the Muck work. It's not those straws on the camel back. We can reduce the loading to the system, but if that system is already choked, we may need to go in and do some restorative work as well. And I'll just leave you all with this. Individual commitment to a group effort, that is what makes a team work, company work, society work, and civilization work. So it's all the amazing efforts that we're hearing about here today that add up to where we need to get. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Yeah.
Great presentation. Looks like we do have a number of questions coming in. So yeah, if folks are still thinking of questions and want to post those in the Q&A thread, that would be great. If you see questions there that you want us to get to, you can also upvote those with the little arrow icon. We do have a fair bit of time for questions, so we should be able to get to a lot of them. Looks like we have a couple of questions here about kind of looking forward to the future. So one is, how do you think climate change will affect the average annual total phosphorus and monthly total phosphorus?
That's a great question. And I was trying to bring the questions up here on my other computer so I can see them as well, but it's confusing. So I'll close it. There's an interesting study done by the USGS looking at stream flow response, and in Wisconsin in particular, to climate change. And there are examples. We can look over the Sugar River next door where 80 plus, actually close to 90% agricultural, and has been for 150 years. Storms more intense, more frequent, more rainfall. The 100-year flood has declined approximately 40% in the last 50 years. Base flow has increased dramatically. The fisheries are relatively healthy, especially for an agricultural watershed. 530 square miles, it's a complex system. What's going on? There's a lot of conservation tillage. There's a lot of no-till, a lot of strip till. There's a lot of cover crops. It's on the shoulder of the driftless area. There's a very strong farmer-led group. And everything that we're seeing coming out of that are fairly consistent data signals that indicate that farmers are infiltrating more water. The soils are healthier compared to what they were 50 or 60 years ago. So even though it's raining more, farmers have built resiliency into the system by shifting these soil health practices. And these aren't just blips in the data. Our long-term trend data show that a pattern of improvement over a couple of years in the Sugar River. And that's from improved practices by farmers. And that's something, if we think about the big picture beyond our own lives, think hundreds of years, the last glaciers were here about 10,000 years ago. These ecosystems developed inherently to be able to absorb threats and punishments that were delivered to them by climate. And so the more we can go back to mimicking the ecosystems that were here, the soil management systems that were here, those systems worked for thousands of years. And that's what farmers are doing with regenerative ag. And I believe there's an afternoon section here we'll hear from what the Dodge County farmers are doing. And that graph I showed with the farmer-led groups, that's what the farmers are going for. And when we look at the Tmdl reductions, those practices that they're doing are the ones that are not only meeting, but exceeding that. And so we really need to support our farmers. We need to support our counties and our agronomists. They're the ones that hold hope for taking on this more extreme precipitation that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, it's a similar question about looking forward to the future. How would you predict that urban sprawl in Madison and Waukesha would impact all of this? Seeming like the basin might be seeing some growth in both kind of the east and west sides in the near future.
Yeah, I worked in Minneapolis for a number of years doing watershed restoration there, and we saw really similar pressures. And it depends on how the development is done, and once we develop land, we lock it in. Generally speaking, we take away the flexibility. The reason farmers can react so quickly, the reason we can see such dramatic change in farms is farmers are independent. And if they want to do something, they can just do it. And once we convert that land use, we take away that flexibility. And so, our past engineering was designed on past climate. We didn't account for changing climate. And so as we move forward, we're going to have to look at how do we design for more extreme events. And we also face the challenge that, just like agriculture, a large amount of our loading from urban areas comes during a time when our urban best practices don't work, or they don't work well, because it's the thaw period, it's the frozen climate period. And so a lot of those practices that we rely on in urban areas don't do well with snowmelt.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Looks like we also have a couple of questions about farmer-led groups. One is, can you speak to the limitations of using SNAP Plus for monitoring with these conservation-led groups, and if there's any plans to update monitoring moving forward?
Sure. So, SNAP Plus is a nutrient management planning tool. And so in and of itself, it's not monitoring per se. What we do know is farmers that are actively engaged in doing nutrient management planning tend to be the farmers who are really dialing in their systems. They're running efficiently, they're running effectively, they care about the longevity of their farm. And SNAP Plus is a planning tool. Just like QuickBooks or any other financial thing out there is a planning tool that we use in our personal finances. We plan. It may not go that way, but the fact that we keep planning and advancing and revising and planning and showing that we're caring about saving for retirement, that's what nutrient management planning is, and that's what SNAP Plus facilitates. As far as monitoring, something I think vitally important is that when I talk about the memory in our watershed systems, what happens at the edge of the field is not the same as what we measure in the stream. And Kyle's presentation earlier this morning really showed that. You can have a lot of great watershed implementation, but if we have a ton of sediment, legacy sediment, choking the system, we know that if we, that's there because we've dumped a ton of sediment and a ton of water into our streams. We start doing conservation practices, we hold that sediment back. We have more water coming into the streams because of increased rainfall. That water is going to be sediment hungry. So the natural process is to mine that phosphorus and mine that sediment out of the system. So that's where we have to start asking the questions of, do we do an intervention? Because Snap Plus gives us edge of field results. It doesn't tell us what's happening between the edge of the field and that monitoring location in the stream. There can be a lot going on.
Another quick question about farmer-led groups is, are there any like best methods or techniques to get more farmers involved in those?
The groups that I've been involved with, my involvement varies from being, just very much on the fringe with farmers saying, hey, nice, we know that you're supported, but, supporting us, but just stay out of the way, let us do what we want to do. To some groups who are like, no, we want you here, come to every meeting, come to every event. And so it really depends on that local community. And I think it's about trust, and trust is a two-way street. And we say that farmers are supposed to trust us, but we have to show that trust back and say, hey, we trust you, we're going to get you the resources you need. And if you say stay out of our hair, we'll stay out of your hair. That doesn't mean we stop doing enforcement. But when we look at the population of farmers, the vast majority of producers out there some are really pushing the envelope and doing amazing things. A lot are trying some things, and there's just a small amount that we need to do enforcement of. We're not going to enforce our way to restoring our waters. And I think that's vitally important. We can't enforce our way to it. The farmers that are taking the lead, being innovative, and creating a culture of inclusivity, these fun events that their fellow producers want to come to, those are the movers and shakers that are going to change the course of this giant ship.
Absolutely. Great. Let's see. Is there anywhere that folks can find information on what point sources are choosing to do to reduce their phosphorus discharge?
Yeah, so if you go, I direct you to the DNR website, and you can go to the adaptive management page, you can go to the water quality trading page, and you can find links there to see what facilities are doing adaptive management for water quality trading. And those permits, we approve them as a state. They do ultimately get reviewed potentially by the federal government, so they're public record.
Great. Cool. I think maybe our last question here, looking forward over the next decades or centuries, what changes do you see necessary in the basin to continue the trajectory of improved water quality, especially in the context of changing climate?
So I think, this is where I get up on my soapbox. As consumers, we need to put our money where our mouth is. Our farm economy is a really weird system. And we've got this farm bill and all these things out there. And we say that we're willing to pay farmers to do the right thing, but we don't. The money doesn't get to the farmer. And so the farmer either has to do it on their own and they have to take all the risk themselves, or maybe some government program that may or may not pay them. And so the example I like to use is BGH, bovine growth hormone. And so in the early 90s, there was 4 or 5 companies that were researching synthesis of bovine growth hormone. And that's the hormone that tells a nursing cow that she needs to keep producing milk for her calf. And so that got patented, and we were told in the early 90s that 100% of the dairy herd across the nation was going to be using bovine growth hormone. That's what we were told. And their stock went through the roof, and it caused all this pushback. And so small companies, we have some of them here, Organic Valley, etc. I'm not endorsing anybody. They, maybe they were always organic. They had a different vision. They said, we're only going to buy milk that doesn't include bovine growth hormone. Other companies, moderate-sized companies said, they heard pushback primarily from moms. Mom said, I don't want that milk in my kid's milk. I don't want that hormone in my kid's milk. And they heard it strongly. And they were able to charge 25 cents or 50 cents more per gallon for milk that was BGH free. Well, guess what? You can't run 2 supply lines when you're a dairy. The infrastructure is too expensive. You can't financially do it. You can't run 2 sets of trucks, 2 sets of drivers, 2 sets of holding tanks. You can't do all of that. And so, interestingly, a big part of this initiative was actually led by farms that were CAFOs, looking at the expenses and not seeing the returns that they were anticipating. And so now today, like less than 12% of our herd in Wisconsin are cows that get BGH. And so you can go and get the store brand milk at Target, store brand milk at Walmart. They're all BGH free because consumers spoke really loud with their dollars and they said, we will pay more. And that's an example where enough consumers came together and they changed the entire industry. And you know, looking long term with climate and all these other things facing us, if these are the things that we're saying we want from our farmers, then people need to come together and we need to financially support our farmers to do that.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for your presentation and answering all those questions, Mark.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to give folks an idea of what's coming up with the rest of the day, we will have a 45-minute break here. So you can go grab some lunch. Feel free to visit the exhibitor and sponsor booths, all that good stuff on the event movie platform. And then we'll be back at 1:15. There will be 2 concurrent breakout sessions. You can pick one. One is from partnerships to implementation. I believe Mark might have mentioned this earlier. It's focusing on some stuff that's going on in Dodge County. And there's also going to be a session on adaptive management in action. Also something that Mark touched on here. And that'll be focusing on work in Madison and Economowoc. So I hope you'll join us then. Thanks again to Mark for a great presentation, and I hope you'll join us in the afternoon.